So now I have erased my excess pencil lines on the cone, and I'm ready to go into that shape, that form I should say, with my next layer. I'm going to start in very much the same way, except now I'm going to have a slightly more saturated paint, which just means more paint, less water. Still kind of avoiding that reflected light for now, but I will be getting into that area a little bit with this layer. Gonna turn my page. Now watercolor does dry pretty quickly, so you do want to work kind of quickly, but not so quickly that you're rushing the process. I'm just gonna add a little more paint. And I can tell that I did not quite rinse off my brush very well from using my yellow because the two colors are making sort of a neutral because yellow and violet are complements. But for the sake of this demo, that is okay. So again, I'm going to make sure that that highlight area stays mostly untouched. And now I am going to soften the edge for my reflected light a little bit. Gonna put a little more pigment down. So you'll notice that anywhere where I'm putting the pigment, it is spreading a little bit because that form is still wet. So once again, what I'm doing is letting that water help me create the value range that I'm after. And I'm drying my brush off before I go into any of those areas that are meant to be lighter, because I don't want my paint to flow as much in those areas. So that might be a second layer on the cone. I still would not necessarily consider that finished, partly because I would want to brighten it up and make the values and the transitions as smooth and clean as I can. But what I'm going to do right now is go ahead and move on to the darkest side of my cube now that my shadow is dry enough. So I'm going to turn my page back again. Actually, I'm going to turn it upside down, I think. Move my paint out of the way. Get a pretty decent amount of pigment on my brush. And start in with quite a bit of a darker value than I had originally, because I know that this side of the cube is pretty dark. Because unlike the sphere and the cone, the dark side of a cube is pretty much entirely in shadow, simply because the faces are flat. So again, I'm going to leave that reflected light and just fill that space in carefully so that I don't get too much of my dark value where I don't want the dark value, such as on the top side or the side that is facing the light source. So now at this point, I've got a pretty good start on my darkest part of my cube. I am going to soften this edge just a little bit here. Put a little water here, because that's eventually going to be my reflected light, remember? I'm going to smooth out my value transition a little bit by just gently going back over the whole side to prevent any unwanted puddling or pooling or any of that. But then I would let that dry before I make it any darker, because if you keep going on top of watercolor while it is still wet, all that is going to happen is that water is going to continue to dilute the color and the value, and you're actually never going to be able to make it darker until you let those values dry between layers. So now I'm just going to go with a slightly deeper red on top of that shadow here, because right now my sphere is still a little bit too wet to work on. So now I'm just darkening the shadow on the side of the cone. Keeping in mind now, I want to make sure that that darker value stays in a specific spot. So I'm going to treat it very much the way I did the cube. And just add a little water or dry my brush off as I take that value further and further out. So essentially shading is creating a bunch of graduated value scales and really practicing keeping them smooth so that your value transitions can remain believable and successful. So right now I'm just going to put another darker blue on my sphere shadow, because again, this edge of my core shadow on the sphere is still wet, so I'm not going to work on the reflected light or a second layer quite yet. I want to let that dry a little bit more first. Now, one nice thing about some of these cool colors is that if I were to be using my blue as a shadow for green or something, it would not only help you create blue-green, but it would also make that shadow darker and deeper than if you just used green. And I'll show you that in just a minute. So there's a second layer on that shadow for my sphere. While I'm waiting for other things to dry, I'm just going to work back into that shadow on the cube now. Once again, just deepening it, especially closest to the form. Dry my brush off a little bit so that that pigment can kind of soften and get lighter as I get further away here. Now, a couple of nice things, like I was saying about watercolor, are I could easily lift up any sort of this value. Like if I get something too dark, I can lighten it by adding water and pressing down with a paper towel or napkin or tissue of some sort. And then that would allow me to bring some lightness back into that area. So now what I'm going to do is let these dry a little bit, and then I will come back and I will show you sort of some more of those finishing steps for the watercolor shading process.